The woman from his past. A city of dreams and a face from the past. James Caldwell walked briskly through Chicago's financial district, his mind occupied with a high-stakes $50 million acquisition deal. His expensive Italian leather shoes clicked rhythmically against the pristine pavement, each step a reminder of his unwavering ambition. Wealth, power, influence. These were the pillars of his empire, things he had fought tirelessly to achieve since he was just a nobody with a dream. The sun gleamed off the towering skyscrapers, and as James adjusted his silk tie, his thoughts raced through investment strategies, legal contracts, and market trends. To the world, he was James Caldwell, the real estate mogul, but beneath the polished suits and billionaire status, he was just a man who had learned to stop looking back. At least, until this moment. Something made him pause mid-step. A presence, a familiar energy. His sharp instincts, honed from years of reading people and sealing deals, picked up on something that didn't belong in this landscape of wealth. His gaze flickered toward a figure huddled against a building's cold stone wall. A woman, with two small children at her side. She was wrapped in a thin coat, clutching the twins to her as if shielding them from the biting November wind. The kids, twins by the look of them, pressed close to her sides. James felt an odd sensation in his chest, a pull he hadn't felt in years. Why was he drawn to them? Then the woman looked up. His heart stopped. His breath hitched. The city faded into silence. Julia. It had been 8 years since he had last seen her, 8 years since she vanished from his life. Yet there she was, exhausted, worn down, a shadow of the woman he once loved. And at her side, 2 children with faces too familiar to ignore, a past that refuses to stay buried. For a moment, James thought he was dreaming. How could this be real? Julia Anderson, the love of his life, the woman who had disappeared without a word, now standing before him in rags, her arms wrapped protectively around twins who looked just like her. And him, a little girl, her dark curls wild from the wind, peeked up at him with curious hazel eyes. His eyes. Beside her, the boy was more hesitant, clutching his mother's sleeve with a guarded look in his deep-set gaze. James's gut twisted. No, it can't be. Could it? He took a tentative step forward, his voice hoarse when he spoke. Julia. She flinched. A flicker of fear crossed her features before she steeled herself, her arms tightening around the children. James felt a rush of conflicting emotions, shock, confusion, anger, but above all, a painful yearning. Years ago, she was his everything. And then, without warning, she was gone. Where have you been? His voice was tight, each syllable laced with disbelief. Julia glanced away, her jaw clenching. It doesn't matter. James's fists clenched. Doesn't matter. He exhaled sharply, trying to keep his emotions in check. Julia, you? His gaze flicked to the twins again, their small frames trembling from the cold. His stomach churned. They were his. He could feel it in his bones. Are they mine? The question left his lips before he could stop it. Julia's entire body stiffened. And in that second, James knew the answer before she could even say it. A truth too heavy to bear. Julia's gaze darted to the street, her muscles tensed, as if ready to run. Don't. James stepped in front of her before she could flee. Don't walk away again. I'm not your problem, James, she whispered. We never were. We. His heart pounded against his ribs. That's not your choice to make. His voice was rough, layered with 8 years of buried pain. The twins watched the exchange with wide eyes. The little girl, Emma, clutched her mother's hand but studied James with open curiosity. The boy, Caleb, was different. He stood rigid, his protective stance making something deep inside James ache. James wanted to argue, to demand answers, but as a particularly cold gust of wind blew past them, he saw something else. Julia was shivering. The twins were shivering. They weren't just on the streets for a day or two. They had nowhere to go. James's gut twisted. The woman he once planned to marry, the woman he had dreamed of building a future with, was homeless. "Come with me," he said, his voice softer now. Julia's eyes flashed with defiance. "No." James ran a hand through his hair, his frustration mounting. "For God's sake, Julia, look at them." He gestured toward the twins, his voice dropping. "They're freezing." Julia swallowed hard. She was stubborn, but she was a mother first. James saw the moment she wavered, and when Emma sneezed, it broke whatever resistance she had left. Julia exhaled shakily. "Fine." James nodded, relief flooding through him. "Let's get out of the cold," he said. "Then we talk." An unfinished story. The hotel suite was a stark contrast to the icy streets. Warmth enveloped them as James held the door open for Julia and the twins. The kids clung to their mother, their faces tense with uncertainty. James pulled off his coat, tossing it over a chair. His heart was still racing. He had so many questions. Why had she left? Why hadn't she told him about them? How long had they been struggling? Had she really thought he wouldn't want them? Julia avoided his gaze as she helped the twins out of their damp clothes, wrapping them in plush towels. They were so small, so fragile. James's jaw tightened. They had been his responsibility all along, and he hadn't even known they existed. That thought alone nearly brought him to his knees. When Julia finally turned to face him, her expression was unreadable. "This doesn't change anything," she said, her voice quieter now. "Tomorrow, we're gone." James's chest ached. Like hell they were. Tomorrow, the truth would come out, and nothing would ever be the same again. Unraveling the past. A night of unanswered questions. The hotel suite was warm, but Julia still felt cold. She stood by the window, staring out at the Chicago skyline, the city lights stretching endlessly before her. Behind her, James was silent, his presence an unspoken storm in the room. The twins were curled up on the couch, wrapped in thick hotel blankets, their small bodies finally relaxing in the warmth. Caleb was half asleep, while Emma kept sneaking curious glances at James. The man she didn't yet understand was her father. James hadn't said a word since they entered the room. Not since he'd taken one long, staggering look at them, at their identical noses, at the way Emma tilted her head just like he did when he was deep in thought. Not since he'd seen the undeniable truth for himself. But now, as Julia refused to turn around, refused to meet his gaze, he finally spoke. "Why didn't you tell me?" Julia's fingers dug into her sleeves. She had been expecting the question. But that didn't make it any easier to answer, because she had told him. She'd written letters, so many, begging for a response, pleading for a call, waiting for any sign that he cared. But nothing had come. And in the silence, she had assumed the worst. Julia closed her eyes. "James, this isn't a conversation we need to have right now." His laugh was sharp, humorless. "Right now? When exactly were you planning to have it, Julia? Maybe never?" His voice had an edge, anger, disbelief, betrayal. "You just, what? Left? Took my kids and never looked back." Julia spun around then, anger flaring in her chest. "I didn't just leave, James. I tried. I wrote you, I called. Her voice broke. You never answered." James frowned, confusion flickering across his features. "I never got any letters." "Liar." The word slipped out before she could stop it. James's hands curled into fists at his sides. "You think I wouldn't have come for you? You think I wouldn't have dropped everything if I knew you were pregnant?" Julia swallowed hard. "I don't know what to think anymore." She didn't know how much of her past pain was justified anymore, how much of it was built on an assumption that maybe wasn't even true. James shook his head, his jaw tight. "We'll find out." His voice was low, firm. And Julia had no doubt that James Caldwell, the ruthless billionaire negotiator, would find the truth. But it wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't change the years she spent alone. It wouldn't change the nights she cried herself to sleep, holding her newborn twins, wondering why the man she loved had abandoned them. Nothing could change that. Not even the truth. The ghosts of the past. Hours passed. The city outside remained alive. But in the suite, time stood still. James sat in the armchair across from her, hands clasped together, his brows furrowed. "Tell me everything," he said finally. Julia exhaled, knowing she had no choice. So she did. She told him about the moment she found out she was pregnant. The terror, the disbelief, the hope that quickly turned into heartbreak when her letters went unanswered. She told him about how she had nowhere to go, how her parents had disowned her, how she had spent months in a shelter, working low-paying jobs just to afford formula for the twins, how she had spent years looking over her shoulder, terrified of the day when the world would take away the only thing that mattered, her children. James listened. And as he did, something inside him shattered. "Jesus, Julia," he murmured, running a hand down his face. His eyes glowed with guilt, with something deeper than regret. "I should have been there." Julia gave him a sharp look. "But you weren't." The words cut like glass. James clenched his jaw. "Because someone made sure I never knew. And I will find out who." His voice was steel, a promise. Julia stared at him, then turned away. "It won't change the past." James didn't argue. But deep down, he refused to believe that. The forgotten letters. The next morning, James was gone. Julia woke up to find a note on the table, written in his sharp, precise handwriting. "I need to find out the truth. Stay here, please." She wanted to tear the paper in half. But a part of her wanted to believe him. James Caldwell never let anything go. Within hours, James stood in front of his old apartment building, the place where he had lived before his rise to power. His mind raced. If Julia had sent letters, then someone had kept them from him. And only one person had access to his mail back then. His old assistant, Cameron Green. James wasted no time tracking him down. "Mr. Caldwell," Cameron said with an easy smile as they met in a downtown cafe. What a surprise. James didn't bother with pleasantries. He tossed a stack of old letters onto the table, his movements controlled but lethal. Cameron's face paled. "You intercepted my mail." James's voice was calm, but deadly. "James, I. Save it." James leaned in, his blue eyes cold. "Did you think I wouldn't find out? That I wouldn't notice the years of my life that were stolen?" Cameron swallowed hard. Why?" James cut in, his voice sharp as a blade. Cameron hesitated, then sighed. "You were building an empire, James," he said. "You were unstoppable. And then suddenly, there was this girl, Julia. And she was a distraction. So I handled it." James's blood went cold. "You handled it," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. Cameron flinched. "I thought I was protecting you. You had a future, one bigger than some girl from your past." James stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "You destroyed my future," he said, his voice filled with pure venom. And he wasn't done yet. A reckoning. That night, Julia stood by the window again, waiting. James walked in without a word, his expression stormy. Julia crossed her arms. "Did you find your answer?" James nodded, his hands clenching into fists. "Yes." He told her everything. About Cameron. About the letters that were stolen from him. About the life that had been stolen from them. And when he was done, he looked at her. For the first time in years, Julia saw something raw in his gaze. Not anger. Not guilt. But pain. "I lost them," James whispered, his voice hoarse. "I lost you. And it wasn't even my choice." The words broke her. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to hold on to the resentment that had kept her going for years. But instead, she felt something terrifying. Hope. She stared at James, the father of her children, the man she had once loved more than anything. The man who had just learned he had been robbed of the life he could have had. The weight of it pressed down on both of them. And for the first time in 8 years, Julia didn't want to run. The bridge between us. The weight of the past. Julia sat at the hotel suite's small table, her hands curled around a cup of lukewarm coffee she had long since forgotten. James stood near the window, his jaw clenched as he stared at the city below. His shoulders were tense, his usual air of control and authority replaced by something she had never seen before. Vulnerability. She should have felt victorious. For 8 years, she had believed that James didn't care, that he had chosen his empire over her and their children. But the truth was crueler than her worst assumptions. Someone had stolen her letters. Someone had kept James from ever knowing. And now she didn't know what to do with that knowledge. James. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. He didn't turn around. He didn't speak. He just stood there, shoulders rising and falling with measured breaths, as if he were trying to rein in a storm inside him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. I lost them. Julia's throat tightened. James turned then, his piercing blue eyes burning with grief. I lost their first steps. Their first words. I lost every birthday, every scraped knee, every time they cried and needed their father. His hands curled into fists at his sides. And I can never get those years back. Julia had imagined confronting him 1,000,000 times before. She had pictured his arrogance, his excuses, his indifference. But she had never imagined this, a man broken by what had been stolen from him. Julia looked away. You think I don't know that? She whispered. You think I don't relive those nights, wondering how different things would have been? James's voice softened. Then let's stop wasting more time. Julia's heart slammed against her ribs. She wasn't ready for this. For what he was asking. For what he wasn't saying. James, she murmured, shaking her head. Don't say it. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Don't tell me this doesn't change anything. It changes everything. Julia pressed her lips together. The kids. James stepped forward, his tone gentle but firm. They're ours, Julia. We can't pretend otherwise. And I will not, be a stranger to them. A lump formed in her throat, because she knew he meant it, and that terrified her more than anything. A first step. James didn't push her anymore that night. Instead, he did something unexpected. He sat down next to the twins, who had since woken up and were quietly watching a cartoon on the hotel television. He didn't force conversation, didn't demand answers. He just sat with them. Emma was the first to scoot closer to him, peeking up at him with bright curiosity. Do you know how to braid hair? She asked suddenly, holding up a piece of her tangled curls. James blinked, caught off guard. Julia, watching from the kitchenette, held her breath. James cleared his throat. Not well. Emma scrunched her nose. But you wear fancy suits and have fancy hair. You should know. Julia pressed her fingers against her lips to hide a smile. James, to his credit, actually tried. He took a section of Emma's hair and carefully fumbled through a clumsy attempt at a braid, his fingers stiff but concentrated. Caleb watched from the other end of the couch, quiet but attentive. That's not how Mommy does it, Emma said, unimpressed. James let out a deep chuckle. Then maybe you should teach me. Emma tilted her head in consideration. Okay. And just like that, the ice began to crack. For the first time, Julia let herself wonder, maybe James could be part of their world after all. An invitation to the past. The next morning, James made a decision. He wasn't letting Julia slip away again. She had one foot out the door, always ready to run. He could see it in her guarded stance, in the way she held herself like someone expecting disappointment. But he wasn't letting go this time. When she packed the kids' things into the old battered duffel bag, James stopped her. Where are you going? Julia lifted her chin. We can't stay in a hotel forever. Then come stay at my place. The words hung in the air. Julia stared at him, as if waiting for the catch. James held up a hand. Not like that, he clarified, sensing her immediate resistance. Separate rooms. No strings attached. Just a place where the kids can be safe. A place with heat, with food, with you? She interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. James met her gaze evenly. Yes. She swallowed, looking away. But she didn't say no. And an hour later, they were standing outside his penthouse apartment, the sheer size of it making the twins' eyes go wide with wonder. Emma gasped. It's a castle. James grinned. Something like that. Julia hesitated before stepping inside. Because she knew this was the moment everything changed. Shadows and promises. The penthouse was too perfect. Marble countertops, sleek furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Julia felt out of place, like an intruder in someone else's life. The twins had no such hesitation. Emma spun in circles, marveling at the chandelier, while Caleb immediately found a bookshelf full of titles he could barely read. James stood beside Julia, hands in his pockets. You don't have to run anymore. Julia tensed. James continued. I know it's hard to believe. I know you've done everything alone for years, but you don't have to anymore. Julia's breath shook, because for the first time in years, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. A past that won't stay buried. That night, after the twins fell asleep in their own rooms for the first time in their lives, James found Julia sitting on the balcony, staring at the city lights. She looked lost, and he knew why. She was used to struggling, to fighting alone. She wasn't used to safety. James sat down beside her. What are you thinking? Julia hesitated. That this feels temporary. James's jaw tightened. It's not. She turned to look at him. You say that now. But what happens when reality sets in? When work gets in the way? When you realize that we're not part of the world you built? James held her gaze. And then, in a voice so steady, so certain, he said the only thing that mattered. Then I'll tear that world down to make room for you. The words hit Julia like a tidal wave. Because for the first time, she believed him. And that terrified her more than anything. When walls crumble, a house that feels like home. The days stretched into a week, and the penthouse, once a place Julia swore she'd never stay in, began to feel less foreign. James had kept his promise. Separate rooms, no expectations, no pressure. But still, he was there, present in ways she had never expected. Every morning, he was the one making breakfast before heading to work, often burning toast, mismeasuring pancake batter, but always trying. Every night, he was home in time to help Emma with her drawings or listen to Caleb read aloud from one of the books James had stocked his library with just for them. He had never once hesitated to be their father. And that scared Julia more than she could admit, because every time she let herself believe in this, let herself believe that maybe they could be a family, the memories of the past whispered in her ear. This won't last. He will leave. People always do. But James never left. Not even when she expected him to. And that was even scarier than being alone. A ghost from the past returns. Julia had just finished tucking Caleb and Emma into bed when the knock came. It was late. Too late for visitors. Her stomach twisted with unease. James, already in his nightclothes, a simple shirt and sweatpants, moved to the door with careful steps, his entire frame tensed like a man preparing for war. Julia stood behind him, her heart pounding. When James swung the door open, a man stood there, a man Julia never wanted to see again. Her breath hitched. Julia, the man said, his voice dripping with familiarity. James went stone still. The man's dark eyes flicked to him, then back to Julia. Didn't think you'd end up back in luxury, the man mused, crossing his arms. You always had a talent for falling into rich men's laps, didn't you? James moved before she could react. In one swift motion, he grabbed the man's collar, shoving him back against the wall just outside the penthouse door. The sound echoed down the hall. You have 3 seconds to explain why you're here before I throw you off this floor myself, James growled, his voice dark. The man smirked despite being pinned against the wall. Relax, Caldwell, he said smoothly. I just came to see my kids. Julia's blood ran ice cold. James went still. Slowly, he turned to Julia. The question was in his eyes, but he didn't ask it. Didn't need to, because the answer was already there. Julia's voice trembled when she spoke. Leave, Ryan. Now. Ryan, the man who had once promised her stability, the man who had destroyed it all, just chuckled. I have rights, Julia. His eyes gleamed. And I've come to collect them. A past she can't escape. After Ryan left, Julia felt like she couldn't breathe. She stood in the middle of the living room, arms wrapped tightly around herself, trying to keep from falling apart. James didn't speak at first. He simply waited, and when she finally looked up at him, she saw something dangerous in his expression, a rage that was barely contained. Tell me everything. She didn't want to. Didn't want to dig up the past. Didn't want to remember the man who had once convinced her that he was the only one who would stay, only to leave her in pieces. But James wouldn't let this go. She could see it in his rigid stance, in his clenched fists. So, she spoke. The man who almost broke her. She told James about Ryan Connor, the man she had met when she was 6 months pregnant, alone and desperate. She told him about how Ryan had seemed kind at first, offering her a place to stay when she had nowhere else to go. How he had promised her that he would step in where James had failed. And how slowly that kindness turned into control. It started with small things. A harsh word when she didn't answer his calls quickly enough. A tight grip on her wrist when she told him she wanted to leave. Then it became worse. He had never hit her, but the threat was always there, lingering in the air. In the way he loomed over her, in the way his words cut her down until she felt too small to fight back. And one day when Emma and Caleb were just 2 years old, she had finally gotten the courage to run. She had taken nothing but a bag of diapers and whatever little money she had and vanished in the night. She had never looked back. Until tonight. Until Ryan found her again. James didn't say a word for a long time after she finished. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. He will never get near them again. And Julia believed him. Because James Caldwell did not make empty promises. A father's claim. The next morning, Julia woke up to the sound of James on the phone. His voice was calm, sharp, the way it always was when he was in control of a situation. She stepped into the living room just as he hung up. James turned to her, his expression unreadable. Ryan filed for parental rights, he said flatly. Julia's stomach dropped. What? She whispered. James exhaled slowly. But it won't matter, because I've already taken action. She swallowed hard. James. I had my lawyers start an emergency custody claim. His voice was firm. I am their biological father, and I will fight for them. Julia stared at him, her heart racing. He was serious. Dead serious. This wasn't just about protecting them from Ryan. This was about James staking his claim. About him making sure his children never had to question who their father was again. And Julia? She wasn't ready for this. For the intensity in his gaze, for the way he was stepping into their lives so fully, so fearlessly, for the way she wanted to believe in him. But Ryan wasn't just going to disappear, and James was ready for war. A storm on the horizon. The weeks that followed were a blur of court filings, legal battles, and heated confrontations. James fought like hell. Julia watched in awe as he stood in court, his voice strong, unwavering, as he made his case, as he proved, without a doubt, that he was the only father Emma and Caleb needed. And when the judge ruled in their favor, when Ryan was finally forced out of their lives for good, Julia felt something shift inside her. She had spent so long running, so long believing she had to do everything alone. But James had fought for them. And suddenly, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't alone anymore. A love that refuses to fade. A war fought and won. The sound of the judge's gavel struck like thunder. The courtroom was silent. Ryan sat across the aisle, his expression dark with fury as the ruling was handed down. Custody denied. All parental rights revoked. James didn't celebrate, didn't smile. His focus was on Julia, whose shoulders sagged in relief. Beside her, Caleb and Emma sat in quiet confusion, too young to fully understand what had just happened, but instinctively aware that something big had changed. Ryan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. James's body tensed, his hand resting on the table's edge, ready to move if necessary. But Ryan didn't make a scene. He just stared at Julia, his eyes burning with something bitter and cold. "You'll regret this." James rose instantly, his presence a silent warning. Ryan's lip curled, but he turned and walked out of their lives forever. Julia didn't breathe until the doors slammed shut behind him. And when she finally exhaled, she felt lighter than she had in years. She looked at James, the man who had stood by her, fought for them. The man she had once loved. The man she had never stopped loving. And she wondered, maybe it was time to stop running. A new beginning. The next few weeks passed in a blur of adjustments. For the first time in her life, Julia felt safe. Not just because Ryan was gone, but because James was there. He was consistent. He made breakfast every morning, even when it ended in burnt toast. He picked up the twins from school when Julia had to work late, never complaining, never acting like it was an inconvenience. And every night, he read them bedtime stories, his voice low and steady, his presence an anchor in their lives. But it wasn't just the kids. It was her too. The way James looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. The way he always made sure her favorite coffee was in the kitchen. The way he had rearranged his entire work schedule to be home for dinner. Julia had spent years believing she had to do everything alone. That love was a liability. That it was easier to never need anyone. But James was proving her wrong. And it terrified her. Because if she let herself believe in this, if she let herself love him again, what if she lost him? What if this was temporary? She wasn't sure her heart could survive breaking twice. The distance between us. James could feel her pulling away. She was comfortable around him now, but there was still a wall between them. A distance that shouldn't be there anymore. One night, after tucking the twins in, he found her sitting on the balcony, her arms wrapped around herself. The city stretched before her, but her eyes were unfocused, lost in thought. James leaned against the doorframe. "Penny for your thoughts." Julia flinched. She hadn't noticed him. She forced a small smile. "Just thinking." James stepped forward, pulling his chair beside hers. "About." She hesitated. Then, after a long silence, "This doesn't feel real." James's jaw tightened. "Why?" She exhaled, staring at the skyline. "Because everything good in my life disappears." James didn't answer right away. He knew what she meant. He knew the weight she carried, the fear of believing in happiness only to have it ripped away. So instead of offering empty reassurances, he said the only thing that mattered. "I'm not going anywhere, Julia." She finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were wide, uncertain, filled with something fragile and raw. "And if I don't believe that?" James held her gaze. "You will." The night that changed everything. It happened 2 weeks later. A storm raged outside, rain slamming against the penthouse windows, thunder rolling through the city. Emma and Caleb had climbed into bed with Julia, too scared to sleep alone. James found her there, curled between them, her hand protectively resting on Caleb's back, her other arm draped over Emma's small frame. and something inside him broke wide open. He had spent years building his empire, believing that success meant power and control. But this was the only thing that had ever really mattered. James crouched beside the bed, brushing a soft curl from Emma's forehead, then smoothing Caleb's blanket. Julia stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "You're a good father." James's breath caught. She had never said that before, had never acknowledged it outright. His throat tightened. "I wish I had been there sooner." Julia's gaze softened. "So do I." She reached for his hand then, hesitantly, as if afraid he'd pull away. But he didn't. He curled his fingers around hers, his grip strong and sure. And in that moment, he knew. She was letting him in. Finally. A love that refuses to die. The storm passed by morning. The twins woke early, racing to the kitchen, arguing over who got the first pancake. James made 3 extra just to avoid a meltdown. Julia lingered by the counter, watching him cook, a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. When the kids ran off to play, she finally spoke. "I want to stay." James froze. His hand tightened around the spatula, his heart pounding. "What?" Julia swallowed hard. "I don't want to leave." James turned to face her fully. Her eyes were shining, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop." James stepped closer. "Then let me show you." She exhaled shakily. "I don't want to be a mistake." James cupped her face gently. "You were never a mistake." The emotion in her gaze nearly wrecked him. She nodded, barely, tears slipping down her cheeks. And then, finally, after years of lost time, after heartbreak and silence and pain, she leaned into him. And when he kissed her, slow and deep, she let herself believe. Because for the first time, she wasn't running anymore. Love tested. A love that feels real. James woke up before sunrise, the city still quiet beneath the soft glow of dawn. He turned over and saw her. Julia. Asleep beside him. Her dark hair spilled over the pillow, her face relaxed in the kind of peace he hadn't seen in years. For so long, he had been chasing things that never mattered. Success, wealth, power. But this, waking up to her, knowing that she had finally chosen to stay, it was more valuable than every dollar in his bank account. His fingers skimmed her cheek gently, not wanting to wake her, but needing to touch her just the same. Her eyelashes fluttered. A small sound escaped her lips as she stirred, her body instinctively moving closer to his warmth. "Morning," she mumbled sleepily. James smiled. "Morning." She peeked up at him, blinking the sleep away. "Are you staring at me?" "Absolutely." A slow, shy smile crept across her face. It was such a small thing. But it was also everything. A life they are learning to build. Breakfast was a chaotic disaster, as it always was. Caleb was meticulously lining up his blueberries into a perfect row. Emma was spilling syrup everywhere, giggling as she tried to spread it evenly across her pancakes. James watched it all, sipping his coffee, taking in the whirlwind of noise and mess that had become his new normal. And he loved every second of it. Julia caught his gaze from across the table, her expression soft, knowing. "What?" she asked. James leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. "This is the best part of my day." A tiny flash of emotion crossed her face, so fast he almost missed it. Almost. But before she could respond, the doorbell rang. Julia frowned. "Are you expecting someone?" James shook his head, standing. When he opened the door, a familiar face was standing there. His father, a father's shadow. Richard Caldwell was a man of steel and stone, a man who built his empire on discipline, control, and ruthless ambition. And James had spent his entire life trying to escape him. His father's sharp gaze flicked over James's rumpled shirt, the way he had clearly just woken up. Then he looked past James, at Julia, at the twins sitting at the table, oblivious to the tension filling the air. A slow, calculated smile stretched across Richard's face. "Well," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation, "this is unexpected." James clenched his jaw. His father hadn't bothered to visit in years. Not when James built his first business. Not when he made his first $1 million deal. Not when James had been alone, struggling, trying to prove himself. But now, when James finally had something real, now he shows up. "What do you want?" James asked, voice clipped. Richard didn't answer. Instead, he looked at Julia, eyes assessing. "So you're the woman who disappeared with my son's children." Julia's spine went rigid. James took a step forward, putting himself between them. "You don't get to talk to her like that." Richard smirked. "I was just making an observation." James fisted his hands at his sides, his pulse hammering. "Get to the point, Dad." His father tilted his head. "You're making decisions based on emotion, James. It's a mistake." James stilled. He knew exactly where this was going. "You've built an empire," Richard continued, his voice low, persuasive. "You've spent years becoming the kind of man who doesn't let distractions get in the way." Julia flinched, her fingers tightening around her coffee mug. Emma and Caleb were still laughing over their breakfast, unaware of the storm brewing. James's blood boiled. Richard leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You don't see it now," he said, "but she will be your downfall." James exhaled slowly, deliberately, forcing himself to stay calm. Then he looked his father in the eye and said the words he should have said years ago. "No, Dad." His voice was steady. "She's my future." Richard's expression didn't change. But James could see it, the slight twitch in his jaw, the barely concealed flicker of disapproval. Then, finally, his father let out a small chuckle. "Well," he said, straightening his cuffs, "I suppose we'll see how long that lasts." James had spent his whole life trying to prove himself to this man. But in that moment, standing there with his children at his back and Julia by his side, he realized something. He didn't need his father's approval anymore. And that was true freedom. A choice she can't take back. That night, Julia sat at the edge of the bed, hands clenched in her lap. James stood by the window, staring out at the city. His entire body was tense. She knew why. His father's words had left a scar. James turned to her, his face unreadable. "Are you staying?" Julia swallowed hard. The truth was, she didn't know. She loved him. God, she loved him. But love wasn't always enough. James was a man who had built a kingdom on control. She was a woman who had spent her entire life running from control. Could they really make this work? She took a shaky breath. "I don't want to hurt you." James's eyes darkened. "Then don't." It was so simple for him. But for Julia, it wasn't simple at all. She stood, her hands trembling. I need time." James exhaled sharply, nodding once. "Right." The disappointment in his voice gutted her. She reached for him, but he stepped back. Julia's heart cracked. Because for the first time, James was the one pulling away. The breaking point. The next morning, Julia packed a small bag. She told herself it wasn't permanent, that she just needed space, that she would be back. James didn't stop her. He didn't say anything at all. He just stood there, watching her go, his expression unreadable. And as Julia walked out of the penthouse, her heart shattered. She had made her choice, and she wasn't sure if she'd ever be able to take it back. Love that stands the test of time. A choice that can't be undone. The suitcase was small. Julia had packed it with the bare essentials, telling herself she wasn't leaving forever. Just taking a break. Just breathing. The penthouse felt suffocating, too full of memories, promises, and emotions she wasn't ready to handle. James stood in the living room, his hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression that tore her apart. He didn't try to stop her, didn't demand answers. And that hurt worse than if he had yelled, worse than if he had begged her to stay. Because James Caldwell never begged. And if he wasn't fighting for her anymore, maybe she had already lost him. Are you coming back? The question hung in the air, heavy, fragile. Julia swallowed hard. I don't know. James's jaw tightened, but he nodded once, stepping back as if giving her space, as if letting her go. Julia turned before she could change her mind. And when the door clicked shut behind her, she told herself she had made the right choice. So why did it feel like she had just torn her own heart out? An empty life, without her. James sat in his office, staring at the untouched contracts stacked neatly on his desk. The city buzzed outside his floor-to-ceiling windows, but inside, everything felt too quiet, too empty. Julia had been gone for 3 days. 3 days of silence. 3 days of the twins asking where she was, if she was coming home. 3 days of numbness, of going through the motions of meetings, deals, success that suddenly felt meaningless. James had spent his entire life controlling every outcome, making sure he never lost anything important. But he had lost her. And for the first time, he had no idea how to fix it. Her life without him. Julia sat on the worn couch in Sarah's tiny apartment, staring at the cold cup of tea in her hands. You don't look okay, Sarah said bluntly, sitting beside her. Julia laughed humorlessly. I'm fine. Sarah arched an eyebrow. You just left the father of your kids, the man who has done nothing but fight for you since the moment he found you. You don't look fine. Julia squeezed her eyes shut. She hadn't expected leaving to feel like this. Like she had ripped herself in two. Like she had been hollowed out from the inside. I'm scared, Sarah, she admitted, her voice breaking. Sarah exhaled, leaning back. Of what? Julia stared at the tea, her fingers tightening around the cup. Of losing myself again. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then, softly, are you sure you're not just afraid of being happy? Julia's breath caught. Because the answer came too quickly, too painfully. Yes. The realization that changed everything. It happened 2 nights later. Julia was walking through the city, her coat pulled tight around her, the air crisp with winter's first breath. Then she passed by a bookstore window display. Inside, a father knelt next to his daughter, holding her small hands as she pointed at a book on the shelf, her eyes full of wonder. The man was patient, kind, present. And just like that, a memory flooded back. James sitting with Caleb, helping him with his school project, carefully guiding his small hands as they built a solar system model together. James brushing Emma's hair, fumbling with braids, but trying anyway. James at the dinner table, listening to every story, every little detail, as if their words were the most important things in the world. Because to him, they were. Tears stung her eyes. She had spent so long running, afraid to trust, afraid to believe that love could last. But James had never once abandoned them. Even when she walked away, he had stayed steady, unshaken, waiting. And she realized, standing in the cold, watching a stranger with his child, she had made a mistake, a terrible, devastating mistake, and she had to fix it before it was too late. Coming home. The penthouse felt different when she stepped inside. It was quiet. Too quiet. Then she saw them. James, sitting on the couch, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. The twins curled up on either side of him, Caleb holding a book he wasn't reading, Emma resting her head against James's arm. Julia's heart shattered. Before she could lose her nerve, she spoke. James. His head shot up. His eyes met hers. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, cautiously, James stood. The twins turned. Mommy. Emma launched herself at Julia, knocking the air from her lungs as she squeezed her tight. Caleb followed, more hesitant, but his grip around her waist was just as strong. Julia buried her face in their hair, tears slipping down her cheeks. She had almost lost them. When she finally looked up, James was still watching her. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held everything. A storm of emotions, of relief, of anger, of love so deep it terrified her. She swallowed hard. "I was wrong," she whispered. James exhaled slowly. "About what?" Julia blinked back tears, stepping forward. "About thinking I had to do this alone. About thinking that running would protect me. About—" Her voice broke. James didn't hesitate. He closed the distance, pulling her against him, wrapping his arms so tightly around her it felt like she might break apart if he let go. She buried her face in his chest, gripping the fabric of his shirt, desperate to hold on to him, to hold on to this. "I'm done running," she whispered. James's breath hitched. His grip tightened. "Good," he murmured, his lips pressing against her temple, her hair anywhere he could reach. "Because I never stopped waiting for you. Love that stands the test of time." The next morning, everything felt different. Brighter. Lighter. James sat at the breakfast table, Caleb and Emma chattering excitedly about their plans for the day. Julia stood by the counter, watching him, her heart so full it hurt. James caught her staring and smirked. "Are you watching me?" he teased. Julia rolled her eyes, but smiled. "Absolutely." His eyes darkened with something familiar, something dangerous and thrilling. She shivered. James set down his coffee. "Come here." Julia arched an eyebrow. "Why?" James smirked. "Because I want to kiss you." Her stomach flipped. Emma groaned. "You. Grown-ups are so weird." James laughed, but never took his eyes off Julia. And she never stopped looking at him either. Because this was love that refused to fade. And for the first time in her life, Julia was finally ready to believe in it.